The neighborhood had always looked neat in a way that felt almost artificial, as though someone had carefully curated every lawn, every hedge, every decorative stone to match a glossy brochure no one remembered approving. For years, residents had tolerated the Homeowners Association's strict aesthetic standards, believing the rules were meant to protect property values. But the latest decree struck the community like a cold gust through an open window. The HOA announced that certain non-uniform trees, including the ones in front of our property, had to be removed within 30 days. The letter arrived folded neatly in our mailbox, bearing the HOA's heavy logo, an emblem that had become more symbol of power than community. Inside were details. Certain mature trees, particularly older species that the board deemed visually disruptive, were to be cut down to make way for a new neighborhood theme. They wanted identical ornamental trees lining every street. They wanted a uniform canopy height. They wanted order and symmetry, even if it meant erasing trees older than the HOA itself. Our property had 3 of these so-called disruptive trees, all over 40 years old, planted by the previous owners long before the HOA existed. They weren't jagged or diseased or dangerous. They provided shade in the summer, shelter during storms, and a sense of rooted history in a fast-changing world. Yet to the board, they were simply an eyesore in the way of their rebranding project. The first wave of frustration wasn't ours alone. Neighbors gathered around mailboxes with copies of the same letter in hand, muttering in disbelief. Many had trees they loved, trees that had been there before their mortgages, before their kids, before so many of the rules that had gradually tightened around the community like a tightening loop. Some thought it had to be a mistake. Others knew it wasn't. The board had been talking for months about increasing visual cohesion, and this announcement was the culmination of those sterile ambitions. Still, we hoped reason might prevail. We attended the next HOA meeting with folders full of documents. Professional assessments confirming our trees were healthy, environmental notes on how they supported wildlife, even neighborhood surveys showing that many residents preferred the natural variation over the manicured monotony the board envisioned. We presented studies on carbon capture, heat reduction, biodiversity, and how mature trees positively impacted property values. But none of it mattered. The board listened the way someone listens to rainfall, passive, detached, with no intention of being moved by it. The president, a man who had taken his role far too seriously, concluded the discussion by referring to a clause buried deep in the HOA bylaws that gave the board authority over external aesthetic consistency. He said it was final. The trees were coming down, whether residents agreed or not. The next week, tree removal crews cruised slowly through the streets like silent enforcers. They inspected trunks and marked some with bright orange ribbons, the kind used for demolition. It was unsettling seeing them tied around living wood, as though the trees had been sentenced. Our hearts dropped when we saw ribbons looped around our 3 trees. Each mark felt like a countdown. The removal deadline approached, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People murmured about the unfairness but felt powerless to fight the board. Some even complied early, cutting down their trees before the crew arrived, defeated by the inevitability of the situation. Every fallen tree left behind a stump like a scar, a reminder of the board's tightening grip. But resignation wasn't something we accepted easily. Instead, we spent nights researching property rights, state laws, environmental protections, and exemptions, anything that might offer a loophole or a shield. It was a slow, exhausting process, filled with bureaucratic language and legal obstacles. Still, somewhere in the dense jungle of statutes, we found something promising: a list of protected plant species in our state. Many were rare and environmentally significant. Others were endangered. Nearly all were legally untouchable once planted, even by homeowners associations. The spark of an idea formed. Initially, it seemed wild, maybe even excessive. But the HOA had escalated far beyond reasonable standards, and their rigid insistence on uniformity had crossed from annoying into oppressive. The thought of replacing our removed trees with species the HOA could never regulate felt like poetic balance, maybe even justice. But before any plans could be acted upon, the removal day arrived. The crew was punctual, their truck rumbling to a stop outside our house early in the morning. Their tools clattered as they prepared for work, and the sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. People peeked through windows and stood in driveways, some out of sympathy, others out of curiosity. The HOA president watched from across the street with an air of self-satisfaction, hands folded behind his back like a general overseeing a victory. We stepped aside and allowed the crew to proceed. They were only doing the job they'd been contracted for. The buzzing chainsaws roared to life, and within hours the 3 majestic trees, which had shaded our home through countless seasons, lay in pieces along the curb. Their absence left a hollow feeling, an emptiness that went beyond aesthetics. It felt personal, as though something had been taken from us that couldn't be replaced with simple landscaping choices. That night, as the stump grinder chewed the last traces of roots, we finalized our plan. No longer tentative, no longer just a thought. We gathered lists, maps, documents, and nursery catalogs specializing in protected plant species. The pieces came together quickly. If the HOA demanded uniformity, we would create the exact opposite within the full extent of the law. Instead of 3 removed trees, we would plant not just replacements, but dozens, even hundreds of rare, certified, legally protected trees and shrubs. The HOA could do nothing to stop it once they were in the ground. It was ambitious. It was bold. It was perfectly legal. What began as a desire to preserve our landscape had grown into a quiet determination to challenge the authority that had overstepped its bounds. We would not confront the board with arguments or emotional pleas. Instead, we would respond with action. Slow, steady, and undeniably compliant with the law. The empty lawn outside, illuminated only by the dim glow of porch lights, no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a blank canvas. The next chapter of the story would begin not with conflict, but with careful planning, discreet deliveries, and the planting of the first saplings that would ultimately reshape the entire neighborhood and the fate of the HOA itself. The days following the removal of our trees felt strangely calm, as though the neighborhood had settled into a temporary stillness. But beneath that stillness, something new had begun to root itself, an idea that had grown sharper, clearer, and more determined with every passing moment. The stumps in our yard were gone, the ground leveled, the soil freshly churned. The HOA believed they had won a small victory, enforcing their uniformity with impersonal precision. What they didn't realize was that their victory had unlocked a far greater plan. Before dawn each morning, we returned to our research, cross-referencing state conservation laws, protected species lists, and horticultural guides. The more we read, the more possibilities emerged. Many protected species weren't monumental trees towering over rooftops. They came in all forms: tall, short, flowering, evergreen, and some that looked strikingly ordinary to the untrained eye. Yet once planted, each one would be shielded from removal, trimming, or restriction by regulations far more powerful than any HOA bylaw. The key was documentation. Every protected tree or shrub would require certification from licensed nurseries, along with receipts, planting logs, and patience. Fortunately, several specialty growers in the region cultivated these plants for conservation programs. They weren't advertised widely, and most homeowners didn't even know such sources existed. But after a few discreet calls and emails, we began building connections with nurseries willing to supply the protected species, quietly, efficiently, and in bulk. Soon enough, our plan expanded beyond replacing our 3 lost trees. If we were going to protest the HOA's restrictions, we would do it with scale, dramatic, undeniable, and fully legal. Instead of 3 trees, we would plant 100 protected species across our property. Each would be an untouchable reminder that the board's desire for uniformity had triggered the exact opposite outcome. The first delivery arrived on a weekday afternoon when the HOA president was out, which felt like an unplanned blessing. A plain white truck parked at the edge of our driveway, discreet and unmarked. From it came rows of potted saplings, rare mountain laurels, endangered sandhill plum trees, protected dwarf buckthorns, and dozens more, each carefully labeled and neatly arranged. The delivery team unloaded them quickly, placing them on the grass as though arranging pieces on a board for a game the HOA did not realize it was about to lose. The sheer number of plants transformed our yard into what looked like a temporary greenhouse. Neighbors slowed their afternoon walks to stare. Some were confused, some curious, some quietly thrilled. Many had felt the sting of the HOA's growing authoritarianism, and seeing someone rise up, legally, strategically, sparked a glimmer of hope. They didn't need to say anything. Their lingering glances and half-hidden smiles told us enough. People were watching, and many were rooting for us. We spent hours planning the layout of the trees, marking points on the ground with small flags. This wasn't random chaos. Each protected species had ideal spacing, soil preferences, and sunlight needs. We mapped out clusters that balanced aesthetics, viability, and visibility. The more obvious the planting, the more undeniable the legal protection. It was critical that the HOA saw every single one. The planting took several days. We worked from dawn until sunset, digging holes, moving soil, watering roots, and stabilizing saplings. The repetition was exhausting but also strangely therapeutic. Every tree placed into the earth felt like an act of reclamation, a physical declaration that our property belonged to us. Not to a board, not to a committee, not to an obsession with symmetry. As the saplings took shape across the yard, the transformation became impossible to ignore. Where there once had been open lawn and uniformity, now stood rows of diverse plant life, small bursts of green, red, and silver leaves. The once blank canvas was becoming a living mosaic. Not chaotic, but vibrant. Not rebellious for the sake of rebellion, but restorative. It didn't take long for the HOA to notice that on the third morning, a board member known for her relentless patrolling paused at the edge of our driveway, eyes widening with a mixture of confusion and indignation. She stared at the rows of saplings, her gaze scanning the little flags and freshly turned soil. She didn't say anything. She simply walked away briskly, almost tripping over herself in her hurry. Word had spread. By evening, the HOA president himself appeared, pacing along the edge of our property with a clipboard in hand. He stopped every few feet, scribbling notes, shaking his head, surveying the plantings like a commander inspecting an unexpected fortification. He circled the perimeter twice, careful not to step onto the yard, an unspoken acknowledgement that trespassing would complicate things for him. He left with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and simmering frustration. The next day, a letter appeared in our mailbox. Unlike the previous demand for tree removal, this letter had a tone of forced politeness masking unmistakable irritation. The board stated they had observed recent landscaping changes and required clarification on compliance with HOA-approved plant species. They requested an immediate meeting. But what they didn't know was that we had anticipated every angle. Alongside the letter, we assembled a binder thicker than the HOA rulebook itself. Inside it were certifications of protected status for each plant, environmental documentation, photos, planting dates, receipts, and legal references. We were armed with everything the law required, and far more than the HOA ever expected. When the meeting day arrived, the board gathered in the clubhouse expecting to challenge us. Instead, they faced a mountain of paperwork confirming that hundreds of state and federal regulations now governed every living thing we had planted. The HOA president flipped through the binder with growing disbelief, his shoulders stiffening as he realized the rules he relied on were now powerless. By the end of that meeting, the board didn't issue a single warning. They dismissed us early, visibly rattled. For the first time, the president seemed uncertain. Not angry, not authoritative, just unsettled. The HOA had no legal authority to remove, relocate, trim, or restrict any of the protected species. Our property, once targeted for forced uniformity, had become a sanctuary the board could not touch. But although the board walked away defeated, the story wasn't over. Within days, murmurs began circulating through the neighborhood. Questions, curiosity, even admiration. Residents wondered if they, too, could protect their land from the HOA's demands. A quiet shift was taking place, a ripple of change spreading across the community, and the HOA felt it. What began as a conflict over 3 trees had become something larger, something the board had never anticipated, something that threatened their control in ways they were only beginning to understand. The next chapter would bring consequences neither side had planned for. In the weeks that followed the mass planting, the neighborhood transformed in ways no one had expected. What had begun as our personal act of defiance started spreading, quietly at first, then with unmistakable momentum. Word drifted from driveway to driveway, carried by neighbors weary of uniform lawns, relentless fines, and the HOA's creeping authority. Our 100 protected saplings had become a symbol, a living demonstration that the board wasn't invincible. Residents approached us cautiously at first, asking how we had done it. We answered with patience, sharing what we had learned. The legal codes, the species lists, the nurseries willing to help. Soon, door-to-door whispers evolved into discreet group chats, then into full-blown neighborhood coordination. Slowly, protected plants began popping up in other yards. First one or two, then clusters. Some residents chose flowering protected shrubs, others planted rare dwarf trees, and a few even ordered varieties we hadn't known existed. The HOA board watched the changes with growing alarm. Their carefully curated vision of a symmetrical, manicured neighborhood was unraveling. The president's daily walks became frantic inspections. He roamed the streets like a surveyor desperate to find a violation he could act upon. Yet every new planting was accompanied by certification documents. Every sapling stood behind the impenetrable shield of state conservation laws. Each time the president approached a homeowner with questions, they presented the same binder we had shown him: copies of legal pages, lists of protected species, and nursery receipts. Eventually, he stopped asking questions altogether. But the board wasn't ready to surrender their authority so easily. At a few weeks later, the HOA issued a community-wide emergency landscaping review proposal, announcing a vote to restrict protected species unless individually approved by the board. They disguised the move behind a veil of concern: claims about environmental impact, community aesthetics, and property cohesion. But residents saw through it immediately. This was a desperate attempt to regain control. The vote was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the clubhouse. Residents arrived with arms crossed, expressions hardened, legal printouts tucked under their arms. The room buzzed with frustration. The board sat at the front table, stiff and uneasy, attempting to mask their nervousness with formalities. When the president introduced the proposal, murmurs rippled through the crowd. His speech felt hollow, like a sinking ship plugging holes with paper. He tried to evoke fear about overgrowth, chaos, and declining property values. Yet outside, the blooming protected species told a different story. Yards looked more vibrant than they had in years. Birds and butterflies returned where they hadn't been seen in seasons. Neighbors felt proud, not panicked as the vote commenced. The outcome was swift and resounding. Residents overwhelmingly rejected the proposal. Papers dropped onto the president's desk like falling dominoes. His jaw tightened as he realized the board's authority had been publicly, undeniably rejected. The community had drawn a line, but the fallout was only beginning. Within days, several board members resigned without explanation, leaving empty seats and unanswered questions. Rumors spread that some had quit out of embarrassment, others out of fear of legal repercussions. The remaining members attempted to maintain a facade of control, but the truth was clear. The HOA had lost its grip. Their rules, once absolute, now sat fragile and hollow. With the board weakened, homeowners pushed for a special election to replace the vacated seats. The community rallied behind candidates who supported reasonable oversight rather than micromanagement. These were people who valued individuality, fairness, and the simple idea that a homeowner should have the right to enjoy their own property without intimidation. The election reshaped everything. In the end, the entire board turned over, every seat filled by someone the neighborhood trusted. The former president didn't even show up for the final tally. His reign ended not with drama or confrontation, but with the collective will of the people he once tried to control. With the new board in place, decisions changed immediately. The mandatory neighborhood theme was scrapped. Residents regained the freedom to choose their landscaping without restrictions. Fines were reviewed, many forgiven, and outdated policies were rewritten. Meanwhile, our property, once the focal point of conflict, had fully transformed into a thriving sanctuary. The 100 protected saplings had taken root with surprising vigor. Some grew taller, reaching toward the sky in soft stretches of green and gold. Others began to flower, dotting the yard with colors the neighborhood had never seen. Birds nested in the branches, squirrels darted between trunks, and butterflies flickered through the air like small floating lanterns. What had begun as retaliation had become restoration. not just of our yard, but of the entire community. The protected trees weren't symbols of rebellion anymore. They had become symbols of resilience as the seasons passed. The neighborhood evolved into something more organic, more alive, and more reflective of the people who lived there. The uniformity that once strangled creativity was replaced by diversity, a landscape full of stories, histories, and personalities. It didn't take long before the neighborhood gained a reputation beyond its borders. Visitors came to admire the unique plants, walking through streets lined with rare species found nowhere else in the county. Some joked that it had become an accidental botanical garden. Life settled into a new rhythm. Gone were the tense HOA patrols, the threats of fines, the rigid demands for sameness. In their place came a collective understanding. A neighborhood thrives when its people feel free, not controlled. When its landscape grows with intention, not fear. One evening, as we walked across the yard, the twilight sun cast warm light across the protected trees. Their leaves shimmered softly. The breeze carried the faint scent of blossoms. It was impossible not to feel a quiet pride in what had grown, not just from the soil, but from the community's unity. These trees would outlive us, outlast any board, and stand as permanent reminders that boundaries could be challenged, and that even the smallest sapling could change everything. The HOA had tried to strip the neighborhood of its individuality, but in doing so, they had sparked a transformation they could never control. Through those 100 protected trees, a community rediscovered its voice, firm, rooted, and impossible to remove.